Okay, so we're going to attempt over the next few meetings that we have to put together a biblical view on environmental issues. I think probably my fault. Some of the announcements that went out said it was going to be a biblical view on environmentalism. We're not going to attempt that, but probably something far more safe and less controversial, which is a biblical view on the environment. First question that we have to ask is this one. Does the Bible have anything to say about the environment? No, says Donna. She was teasing. What do we think?
I think it does.
You think that it does? Okay. Why?
Because God made the world. That's the environment, right?
Because God made the world, and that's the environment. That's true at one level. Can we say something more fundamental than that about why we ought to expect the Bible to deal with not just the environment, but if we wanted to understand how to think about biotechnology, if we wanted to understand what to think about other contemporary issues in society or whatever, ought we to expect that the Bible would speak about those issues? What do we think? Jan?
Well, that it provides everything that we need for life and godliness.
Okay.
And so therefore it would address all of those situations.
Okay. That's 2 Peter chapter 1, I think, which says God has supplied us with everything we need for life and godliness. Any other scriptures that we might turn to that will tell us? Yes.
Well, I think if we start in Genesis, we would probably the running start at it.
Start in Genesis and finish at the end of Revelation.
But God shows us the creation account, and not only that, but He also puts man in the garden.
Okay.
In that creation,
Okay, the creation in which man is put in the garden to tend it. But look, stepping back, we're kind of starting up at 30,000 feet here. Any subject, any contemporary issue, is there any issue where we would say, well, the Bible's not going to have anything to say on that? So let's go to a different text that's written by some professor who does have something to say about it. Why would we think, Jan has started us off down this line, why would we think and why should we expect the Bible to talk even about issues that couldn't have been imagined when the actual pages of Scripture were written?
In Ecclesiastes, the preacher says there's nothing new under the sun.
Nothing new under the sun. This is good. All these scriptures I hadn't thought of. What does 2 Timothy 3:16 say? That doesn't mean it's relevant. All scripture is inspired by God and profitable for teaching, for reproof, for correction, for training in righteousness. What does verse 17 say? So that the man of God may be fully equipped. Well, yeah, I mean, there are different translations that come through, but ours, the one we use here a lot, the New American Standard, said, may be adequate, equipped for every good work. For every good work. So what is it that the Bible does not equip us for in life? It's a fairly short list. And if you look at the Westminster Confession, the first chapter on Scriptures in paragraph 6, it says this: the whole counsel of God concerning all things necessary for his own glory, man's salvation, faith, and life, is either expressly set down in Scripture or by good and necessary consequence may be deduced from Scripture, unto which nothing at any time is to be added, whether by new revelations of the Spirit or traditions of men. So it's echoing the thoughts that we had there in, I think, 2 Peter 1, 2 Timothy 3, 16 and 17, various other passages that have been mentioned. It's important to start with this. I know it's pretty basic stuff. But do you think all organizations that call themselves churches in the 21st century would believe that they ought to come here for a view on the environment? That they should come here for a view on reproductive technologies, on genetic engineering? Do you think that's where they would go? I suspect it may not be. So now the next question is this. We know that, therefore, that the Bible does speak about this subject. And Fred has already given us a little bit of a clue about one place that we may want to dip into later on. But could somebody turn up the verse in the Bible that talks about greenhouse gas emissions and read that out for us? Or the one about how to calculate a carbon footprint. Is there a verse like that, a proof text? What do we think?
The world will end in fire.
I'm not sure I want to repeat that on the microphone. Yes, there could be quite an emission towards the end times. Well, what's the answer? Is there a verse? Is it in Hezekiah chapter 3, verse 5, for example? Is that where you might look for this particular text? BJ?
No, but the Bible is not a technical manual per se.
Okay.
That's like asking the Bible, like trying to go to the Bible to fix my car. I mean, it's application.
Okay. There is no proof text. It doesn't actually deal, to the best of my knowledge, with carbon footprinting and greenhouse gas emissions and energy and renewable resources and all that kind of stuff. So, how then are we going to use the Bible, which we know will help us on this subject? We've all agreed to that. How are we going to use it? Are we going to do the sort of approach? That's interesting. Is that going to help us out? Take the pen, open the Bible, put it in a page and see what it says. And then we can figure out what that's got to do with the environment. You know the story about the woman who decided this was a good system for biblical guidance, and she closed her eyes, opened the book, put the pin in. You must have heard this story. And the text was, and Judas went and hanged himself. And she said, well, that's not very useful. I'll try again. So she opened the page, put the pin in, opened her eyes and looked, go and do likewise. It's not the best system that there is for guidance. So what should we do? What we're going to do is to derive principles from Scripture that will help us to construct a framework around this whole subject of the environment. And the subject that's going to occupy us over the next few meetings that we have is the environment, but I want to make it very clear that this is a kind of worked example of how you can approach many, many issues. Especially when the issue looks so big and complex, you don't know where to start. This is where to start. You come back to the Bible and you look for the principles. Lots of people, we're going to talk a little bit about this in a moment or two. Lots of people, when they're faced with a problem, what do they tend to do? I'm sure you know people like this. If I started up the meeting today by saying, what should the Christian do about the environment? What would the answer be?
We dive into the details.
Right.
The weeds and
It's so tempting. We want to get into the weeds. We want to feel like we're doing something, because to spend time up here seems a little bit abstract. But actually, I guarantee you that if you put the framework together, it will focus what you do concerning an issue. So you don't waste your time. If you're dealing with weeds over here, and the main problem is over here somewhere, then you're wasting your time. So it's really worth following this approach and learning from this approach, so that you could develop for yourselves a biblical position on gene technology, on whatever other issues happen to arise out there. We don't have to be caught flat-footed. We've got everything that we need right here and right here to be able to train ourselves with the help of God's Spirit to think biblically about these issues. So this is what we're going to do over the next few weeks. We're going to define the problem. Then we're going to derive the principles from the Bible that apply. And then we're going to put them together into a biblical framework. And then we'll see what it is that we should be doing. Okay, so it's going to be take aim, get ready, shoot. Not shoot, aim, ready, or whatever. So let's define the problem first. And we'll do this the way a doctor would, maybe. I'm not a doctor. But okay, now, according to the media and many of the scientists, and I'm by no means, please understand, by no means am I trying to denigrate the work that has been done or necessarily all of the observations that are being made. We'll come to an assessment of some of this as we go along and get a bit more of a biblical framework in place. But what do you hear? It's really difficult to go anywhere, read anything. Something on the radio this morning about dead polar bears. I don't know if anybody heard that. But what are the symptoms? Think about the last 15 to 20 years. What are people pointing to? Issues that are happening in the environment. Okay, ozone layer. Does everybody remember that one? Need a little bit of background? Essentially, the refrigerants that keep your fridges cool, or used to, Freon in particular, and they were used as propellants in aerosol cans. It was decided, once they came out of the can or out of a used and sort of junked refrigerator, made their way up, reacted with ozone, and basically at the polar ice caps, the ozone layer that protects us from harmful radiation from the sun was getting thinner and thinner and actually non-existent in places. So there was the hole in the ozone layer. What else are people pointing to? Symptoms of environmental problems. Sean? Right? Global warming.
just to clarify, Greg, when you say symptoms, you're talking about what people are saying, not necessarily what is.
Right. What people are saying are problems with the environment, whether or not they are. This is, yeah, Ty.
The injuries of that global cooling, you showing
Okay. So endangered habitats, species, habitats getting destroyed. What's another consequence that is pointed to as a result of global warming? Okay. Well, they're almost at two different parts of the spectrum here. Global warming, I think, implies a change in temperature as a result of human activity. Climate change could just imply a typical cyclical change in the global climate. Donna? Emissions. Pollution. Because things are warming up, or anticipated to warm up, what's going to happen, or is happening?
Catastrophe.
Okay,
We're
well,
all going to starve to death
okay,
because the food growing regions will be deserts. And
right.
there won't be sufficient water resources in those areas as well.
Yep, flooding, that's the melting of the polar ice caps, which is going to cause sea levels to rise, coastal areas to be inundated, so on and so forth. Water shortages, some areas becoming deserts. I was going to try and show some YouTube clips, which I found a couple of nights ago, but it proved a little bit more than I had time for. One of them said that wine-growing regions are going to change, and of all places, the place that's going to be a place to grow quality wine is England, said the commentator, of all places. And people up in, I didn't quite follow the logic here, but Napa is going to become a marginal wine-growing region. But they interviewed a viticulturalist up there who said he was going to be okay because he put solar panels in. Didn't quite see how that was going to help. Anyway. So, symptoms. What about the causes? Why is all this stuff happening or alleged to be happening? Jan?
Primarily because of man's impact.
Okay. Man's activities. Yep, cows too.
Particularly fossil fuel burning.
Fossil fuel, yeah. You'll hear, this is kind of related, you'll hear people talk about this idea of peak oil, which says that we've already exploited the vast, we've come over the peak in terms of how much oil can be extracted from the earth. It's downhill all the way from here until we get to nothing, at which point our cars won't work terribly well. What else is going on? I think there's population pressures. Okay, deforestation, especially the rainforests. And that is, since the forests take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and release oxygen, that's said to be a problem.
Aren't those all subsets of man's?
They are. It's all really man's activities. I think some people believe that there is just a cyclical climate change, and the warming that is being observed may not be entirely, if at all, due to man's activities. It may just be the fact that the climate changes. Back in Spurgeon's days, every year the River Thames froze over and people would go ice skating on it. That hasn't happened for, well, probably for a century or so. But it was colder then. The winters were colder. Okay, I'll throw in some other things here. If it's not man's activities, who gets to be held accountable for this? Mother Nature. And then if you want to include this, there's the idea of Mother Earth. Has anybody ever heard of Gaia? A borrowed name from a goddess, but it's the idea that the whole Earth is, it's getting a little bit close to a kind of pantheism, I think. It's the whole Earth is some kind of an integrated system, and it almost takes on a personality. Okay, so those are many of the causes that are pointed to account for these things. I'm going to wipe out a bit of space here so we can get to the prognosis. Jan's already said something about this. What's the prognosis? Anybody who knows what a prognosis is? How's it all going to end up? How's this disease going to end up? We're all going to die. Okay. Crisis, disaster, lights out, literally. The end. So, and what are the suggested treatments for these issues? Okay. Population control, renewable energy, recycling, organic. Anybody heard of food miles? I think it's probably a kind of UK phenomenon that may not have found its way over here, but the idea is that every packet of food that's sold in a supermarket should have a calculation and should indicate its food miles. In other words, how far was it transported in order to get it into that store? And if it's transported further, obviously that's worse for the environment because the vehicle that brought it must have been emitting greenhouse gases and so on, and pollution and so on and so forth. So that leads to a kind of eat locally produced, eat local product concept. You get organic, you get a huge movement now around the concept of sustainability, which is being here for future generations, and that certainly has a very, it's not just environment, it's also social and economic, but it has a huge environment component in terms of not having too large of an impact on the environment so that the next generation will still be there and able to survive. carbon footprinting, calculate the footprint that you have in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. This one always, well, I don't know how I can sort of specify my reaction to this. Every hotel room I go into, the hotel, out of the kindness of their hearts, put a little notice that encourages you not to put your towels into laundry because that will save the planet. Because if they had to launder them, that would use detergents, it uses water, and so on and so forth. And that's true enough, but my cynical nature can't help believing that it's also good for the hotel bottom line if you don't make them launder the towels more often than they need to. But anyway,
Right.
yes.
There's also, as part of that, the whole wealth redistribution, which is all part of the Kyoto Agreement and other kinds of things where developed nations have to pay developed nations.
Right.
So there's,
There are various concepts of redistribution, and cap and trade is another example where the polluters can sort of buy emission credits so that they can emit more, but there's only a certain pool of emissions allowed, and you trade within that pool as you need to, and pay money if you need to pollute more. Okay, and I'll underscore, I'm not saying anything to denigrate these things. At the moment, we haven't put together our view. But these things, it's kind of difficult to turn on the television or read a newspaper and not run into this fairly rapidly. Okay, so now that we've defined the problem, what should the believer do? Aha. Okay, trick question. We need to develop those principles. Now, we could think our way through the 66 books of the Bible and say, well, what does Leviticus have to say that could be helpful in addressing the problem? And that's certainly one approach, and we certainly need to know the Bibles well enough so that we could get that kind of overall perspective. But are there any other books that distill the main teachings of the Bible for us in a way that could be helpful? Where we could actually get an overview of the main doctrines that are contained in Scripture, and then try and work out which of those might be helpful to us in putting together a biblical perspective on this subject. Anybody know of any? Yes?
well, I'd say Genesis gives us the beginning and Revelation gives us the end.
Okay.
And it helps us develop that framework for who's in control and what he set forth in the beginning and then what he's planned at the end.
Okay. Genesis and Revelation. And I think we certainly will end up dipping into those books. I'm trying to look at a book that will distill down biblical doctrines into a format where we can access them quite easily. No? Yes. Not a book of the Bible, sorry, I'm misleading you here. A book where people have taken the overview and distilled down central doctrines from Scripture.
The
Westminster Confession turns out to be one, and there are others, systematic theologies, but you happen to have the Westminster Confession in the hymn books that are in front of you. And I think turn to page 847. And we won't read out the confession at this point in time, but if you skim through it and look at the chapter headings, and I'll clean off the board here a little bit, and we will jot down the ones that we think, they won't all necessarily give us as much help as some of them will on this subject, but let's try and identify the ones that are going to be most helpful to us. Chapter 5, which is? Of creation. That's where we get the Genesis account in. 6. The fall. Sean?
Seems like we don't want to ask them 1, 2, and 3. So it tells us how Scripture bears on it in the first chapter, and then tells us about creation in the second chapter. The third chapter is plan. So
Right. 1 and 2. Okay. Is God's decree important in this subject? I think we're going to find that's absolutely of pivotal importance. Providence. Yep. Let me short circuit this a little bit by saying that there is, I think, material in chapters 7 through 18, because you have to look at the whole plan of redemption in dealing with the earth and God's plan for the earth and what happens in the end times and so on and so forth. So 7 to 18, redemption. Okay, is there anything else? Excuse me? Okay. Well, let's have 32 and 33, shall we? The last things. Now, there may be others, but I think that's a pretty good list. Can you start to see how these might help us to think about the subject instead of diving straight in and saying, should I recycle my aluminum cans? To actually come back and say, well, let's understand the framework, the plan of God, why He's created, how He's executing His plan, the condition of man and what that means for the world that we live in, and what God is doing in redemption, not just of mankind, but remember the redemption that Christ wrought is a redemption of all creation from the effects of the fall. And then how things are going to end up, the eternal state, and so on. Can you see how that could give us a framework from which we can start to sift through? Because what I had up on this board before was noise, wasn't it? There's so many conflicting things, and some people say, we've got to do this, and then somebody else comes along and says, well, that's fine, but if you do that, it's going to do this. And if you just dive into that, you're going to get lost. Your mind is going to blow several fuses. But can you see how if we work our way through these headings and try and understand the doctrines a little bit and then how they apply, particularly in this subject of the environment, that when we get down there, we should be able to say, well, then what ought we to do? How should we conduct ourselves in this matter of the environment? And what we come out with will have grounding in Scripture and won't be a kind of knee-jerk, which it's all too easy to do when somebody says the world's going to end. Well, we've just seen an example of what happens when somebody says the world's going to end. And it causes a lot of confusion, a lot of panic, and not necessarily very profitably at the end of the day. So what we're going to do then over the next few weeks is work our way through these headings. It's not going to be an exhaustive doctrinal treatise. We're going to seek just briefly to understand what the key points of these doctrines are, and we've seen that before in our studies on the 4-year curriculum. And then we're going to try and say, well, if this is true, then what does that say about this aspect of the debate on the environment? and what would be a biblical way to view that through the lens that's supplied to us by these biblical doctrines? Does that make sense? And remember that if we get this down as a model, then you can do exactly the same thing. May not be the same doctrines that you use, but you can do exactly the same thing with other contemporary issues. This is a framework for how we can live as believers with a biblical mindset, and how we can train ourselves to approach issues in a biblical way. Any questions? Okay, well, let's close with a word of prayer then.